Funcom, a Nordic video game developer who's been around as long as I've been playing games, basically, and one who has made some of the most appearances on our series, Death of a Game, a show where we focus on investigating the largest contributing factors to a game or company's dying or eventual death. Now, Funcom isn't dead, no. We just happen to be covering another of their games. This time, not unlike the other videos, we see another case of a super strong start, amounting to a rocky launch and fumbling even more past that. But Funcom did team up with one of the more unlikely IPs, and one that recently put out a few successful movies even, based on a much older book series, Dune, or the Dune series. Funcom would secure the rights to make a few Dune games, even, and one of those was the hot topic for this video, Dune Awakening. Funcom's survival game with MMO elements, or some mixture of the two, having just launched this past summer in June of 2025. Dune Awakening was able to sell an impressive 1 million copies in quite a jiffy, becoming Funcom's fastest selling game ever. But in no time as well, that success would turn into a beacon of distress, greatly quantifying how many people would know about the faltering launch for the new virtual world. Fans were echoing many complaints in unison, but worse, the player base had fallen off a cliff, with Dune Awakening, big budget and popularity and all, being relegated to having fewer players than Funcom's previous survival online game Conan Exiles. And so, many are wondering, what went wrong? How did Dune Awakening both manage to be Funcom's biggest success and arguably their biggest fumble? Well, detectives, we have a new case and a repeat perp. We have a timeline to ride and a mystery to solve. Grab your ornithopter or vehicle of choice and let's get to the desert. We have a sandworm to avoid. The story begins with Funcom, a Nordic video game developer who's been around since basically the dawn of time and dawn of MMORPGs, having been founded as a company back in 1993, and one who has contributed greatly to that genre as well, with titles such as Anarchy Online, Age of Conan, and The Secret World. Now, besides Anarchy Online, a product of its time, meaning that they had no idea what they were doing at that time period, the other two titles were both loved and then hated, sometimes at the same time, by the same people. Funcom would eventually branch out into other games alongside their popular adventure game series The Longest Journey or Dreamfall, which is actually one of my favorite games too, by the way. One of these genres, popular especially at the time, was the survival genre. Survival games are essentially vertical slices of a virtual world or MMORPG, playing out much closer to a standard online RPG or lobby type world. The main kicking factor they lack, or I guess core tenet, is the historical lack of permanence, a core tenet of being an MMORPG or even a virtual world. Funcom, who already had experience with utilizing their previous Age of Conan IP, they utilized for a virtual world already, would take the same mantle again, this time with desires to build a survival game of their own, with some permanence to it. Announced 3 years prior to Dune's announcement though, Funcom would state their desire to create a new virtual world, but not the topic of this video. This time, a survival-focused one, also utilizing the Conan IP. Conan Exiles would be first announced in 2016 before launching into early access in a jiffy the following summer. Conan Exiles was plagued with tons of issues at launch, issues of lag, desync, and issues of a poor combat system on top of things. On top of this, early access or not, the content was quite thin for the game. Despite this, Funcom was dedicated to the game and worked to make it far more serviceable over the years post its launch, managing to climb the game back to a near B rating on Steam. Despite all of that work, however, in the end, Conan Exiles wasn't able to overcome how utterly average its combat was and how totally janky it was. This would become a major clue for their later title as well. Shortly after Conan Exiles, in fact, during its growing pains even, Funcom would announce work starting on an open-world Dune game, and I was already suspicious. How on earth could a game not feel or look like Conan Exiles in some way, based on timing and their usage of the same engine and concepts? Well, according to later reports, creative director Joe Bylos, someone they pulled right off of Conan Exiles by the way, having previously also worked as a major designer on other Funcom projects for many years, would state that they would take as long as needed for their upcoming Dune survival game, however. Featured at Gamescom in August of 2022 in a major way would be Funcom's new game, dubbed Dune Awakening, and was for the first time called an open-world survival MMO, which, history lesson for everybody, doesn't actually make any sense, and I'll explain. For starters, an open world is an MMO. It's kind of already implied. These are the same things, most likely just being used here as an advertiser buzzword. Second, a survival game MMO is basically like a sandbox-enabled or focused MMORPG. It has already existed as a concept, hell, even the creator of Minecraft worked on one before he would then create Minecraft. For me, this was a red flag. Either Funcom was just hyping things up, didn't know what they wanted the game to be, or wanted the game to be a full-fledged survival-style MMORPG, which is a lofty goal New World was already attempting and gave up on actually trying before they even launched. Trying to satisfy both audiences of MMORPGs and survival games would actually be tough when the core mechanic of a survival game, the vertical slice genre if you will, is non-permanence and the chance to start again. This helps give you another chance at making things fair in a sense, whereas MMORPG players expect permanence and longer-term progression. These players are similar in ways and have some crossover, but they aren't the same audience. If Funcom wasn't careful, they could end up angering both audiences and satisfying none of them, something they had already done in each genre, MMORPG and survival. Funcom would push things ahead and after a solid 4 years would announce the closed beta of Dune Awakening in November of 2023. Now considering I haven't heard anything about this closed beta before, I'm a sad boy I wasn't invited, I don't know how much was actioned on from this beta testing, and that would probably become clear as the game would become more publicly available anyway. The game would be first previewed in detail March 2024, during the Dune Awakening Direct series. Reportedly, the game was indeed going to be survival-focused, requiring players to shield themselves from the powerful sun as well as keep themselves hydrated, including throwing and eliminating your foes and using their blood, inherently creating a rather PvP-centric environment even baked into the PvE in the game. Funcom's idea, according to creative director Joel Bylos, was about combining the love of survival games and MMORPGs and giving survival game players a more long-term form progression enjoyment than they were used to, and then giving MMO players theoretically more chances to build in a world that they hadn't had before. There was reportedly play for all group sizes as well. Solo, small, or large was also promised. But even here in the comment section you can already see some big questions being asked. Players wanted a clear delineation in their eyes. Was this more of a PvE or PvP game? The answer was obviously PvP, but for those unaware, the ignorance could turn quite toxic. And to be fair, they did promise that the PvP was optional. The main concern though that I have when I read the comments upon first approach was that they were hoping that the PvP doesn't become toxic, because then it would make the PvE unenjoyable. The second direct talks more about the lore of the game, and the two factions and their hub zones, the Harkonnen faction in the Harko village and the Atreides and the Iraqine. Interestingly enough, they also reference for the first time how the actual server architecture was going to work for the game. And long story short, it's a sharding system that connects a bunch of different server clusters together, making for a separate world map experience unless you happen to be in the same instance. This goes along with the fact that the game has a world map system that allows you to travel from instance to instance essentially, and it's not a bad idea, having existed in other single-player RPGs in a different form, but now theoretically you could even be connected to all kinds of worlds and thus players. For example, you as a player chose your home world, and that was where your character and progression was tied. When traveling the world, you could encounter 40 people server shards, like the Haga Basin, the main PvE area of the game, while the Deep Desert or the social hubs in the game could carry as many as like 300 players. Now, none of these numbers are even close to being massive or classified as an MMORPG except for the fact that the world server can hold up to like 1,500 players, so it just feels like this unnecessary burden you placed on your own game and expectations that come with it. When had you just had called it a survival game with MMO elements, people would have been impressed. And that's what you shifted towards later on anyway. You could have managed and even surpassed expectations. Immediately after this info drop was a delay pushing the game briefly with a promised launch on the PC only, still set to come later in the year, in the summer of 2025. It was a bit strange that so close to launch, key core details were barely being laid out and explained. Meanwhile, Funcom was dropping their MMO label, which they would admit only a month before the game was going to launch, in a totally bizarre turn. Whether this was because they didn't think they qualified, or as they stated, they thought that the game was veering too much into the MMORPG direction, which, sorry, doesn't make sense as a pejorative and only makes sense as a pejorative if you couldn't deliver on that vision, so you didn't want the expectations that came with it. The core of Dune Awakening, though, was a survival game. You spawned, gathered resources, and built your base. You then must defend your base against the elements, as well as survive them in your attempt to garner more loot and make your chosen faction the winner of the Landsrat in the Deep Desert. The Landsrat is the incredibly complex sounding system that's essentially reduced to being just a weekly quest system with rewards for each faction. This has already existed for decades. The winning faction reaps the benefit. Hooray! I might sound like I'm being reductive, and maybe I am because of my voice and stuff like that, thanks genetics. But the system literally is a collection of weekly repetitive fetch or kill quests. Not to mention, the majority of the tasks are just for larger groups and take place in the Deep Desert, the in-game zone that was PvP focused, with really good rewards and benefits. This Deep Desert, of course, was hostile. Think old school RuneScape's wilderness, but with a rotating map, more instances, and being connected to all of the worlds. This system had the markings of being quite controversial, even already. And no, not because it's an in-game PvP zone. The issue being, suddenly the game is more of a survival game, and thus people are wondering, well, like with most survival games, can't we just make a private server or a PvE-focused server that can still experience the content? Funcom's answer, no. In fact, private servers hadn't even been mentioned yet. That meant Funcom had the idealistic goal of combining PvP and PvE players together, but we're trying to spearhead it by introducing an in-game PvP zone. While this might sound like it makes sense, as we soon will find out, to create harmony between PvP and PvE players, something like most MMORPGs almost all exhibit, I should add, you have to build a world for that from the ground up and be careful lest you make the same mistake that New World already made, which was trying to be too hardcore without any idea how and then capitulating into a totally different and subpar game in the end. In a surprising move, but baller move in my eyes, Funcom would let their new survival game get tested with no NDA. The clever part was the game was front-loaded in terms of content, with the Haga Basin, the main storyline of the game, being able to be completed completely solo even, and this would give players a false sense of what was to come, thinking that the rest of the game was going to be this fleshed out. Ironically, this is a Funcomism, with them most famously having done it with Age of Conan back in the day, who had this very fully voiced interactive story, and then suddenly after that, fetch quests and a marathon running around to follow. This is likely why many players weren't able to find the clues before the game launched. Well, not all players. Detectives, on the other hand, were catching clues left and right. If you check out the Dune Awakening Direct too, you see players were already asking for when the gameplay and combat were going to be showcased, and wanting more of the nuts and bolts to be showcased too. Reading the comments on the Direct 3 though, and you realize some detectives were right from the beginning. Gameplay, more specifically, the combat was shown for the first time, and it was rough looking. Sure, in certain shots it looked serviceable, like with ranged combat and anything with vehicles, but the melee combat was even jankier than Conan Exiles. This was problematic because melee was the primary form of combat in the Dune universe. That's because you can't even shoot a shield with a laser without causing like a nuclear explosion. I say this as a reader of the Dune books. Yeah, I mean, come on guys, you know I had to drop that somehow, but the warning signs were there for Dune Awakening, and that's why despite being a longtime player of Funcom games, including Conan Exiles at nearly 100 hours, I refused to play Dune Awakening, because I saw too many of the same patterns. Funcom would make even more clues this time, in an incredibly confusing manner though, with announcing private servers literally a week before the launch of their game. Catch being, you had to pay for them, and even if you did, they were not fully customizable, which is something that their previous game of Conan Exiles even allowed for. This felt like a slap in the face. At first it felt like the excuse was, well, the game was meant to be more like an MMO, and then they dropped that, and suddenly still committed to the same plan, so people pushed back, and now we have a private server, but they aren't even close to what we're looking for, especially since they are still connected to the same deep desert in the end. I'll give you my personal opinion on this whole thing. If Funcom was going to make a controversial decision and integrate an endgame zone for PvPvE with the chance of full loot, if you have a specific Landsrat, for example, outside of it, or they get eaten by a worm or partial loot, like losing materials or resources, they couldn't half-ass it. They had to look at games in the past who already did and attempted this stuff and try to see why they succeeded or failed. That's why we created the whole series, guys. A simple example is allowing for insurance systems, where you can't just lose your stuff, including your structure. This could even include a packing system for structures, which actually existed in Star Wars Galaxies, a game from the early 2000s. Another example is allowing for a social hub that actually has a purpose, besides just being an NPC trade location turn-in, which is what it became in Dune Awakening. You do this by adding multiple things I talked about, and even adding like minigames and passive buffs for going to certain places, and generally just making places fun to be at and hospitable, not just like set pieces that look cool. And you have to give them more to do than just be heroes or soldiers. Dune Awakening was the perfect kind of game to allow for other alternative paths of play, gathering only, crafting only, and even like subterfuge. You have to give players a reason to congregate, work together, and socialize, especially in a guild-centric game too. Oof, that's where the other nail in the coffin comes from too. It's the faction system. One of the most powerful tools in balancing a PvPvE game, and almost like required tools, is the faction system. And in Dune Awakening, it was a total dud. Dark Ages of Camelot, a PvPvE game from the early 2000s, was able to seamlessly blend PvP and PvE, and they did it by having 3 main factions and dividing their PvP and PvE early game zones properly. We'll talk more about that in a bit though, because regardless of whatever issues were plaguing the game, and promises that they could keep working on it until it was ready, Dune Awakening was set to launch the following month. Dune Awakening would launch June 10th, 2025, and much like Funcom's other past projects, would be actually able to score impressively at launch, with an asterisk, scoring a 78 out of 100 on aggregate review website Metacritic from 62 different critics. Dune was also able to score 72% on Steam, and for me, these are pretty good ratings for a virtual world, especially a survival one, massive or not. The bigger question was not the success that would happen at launch, but how they were able to react to problems that would come up after. IGN would score the game an impressive 8 out of 10, claiming that the adaptation to Frank Herbert's sci-fi world was impressive, and that beside a few technical bugs, the story and world building were a joy. From most accounts, players and critics alike would agree with this, enjoying the visuals in Dune Awakening as well, and how authentically Dune the game looked and felt. I personally enjoyed the Dune spin on the survival formula, with laser gathering, cloaked individuals, and ornithopters, and other vehicle gameplay brought forth by Jaeger, a German studio in joint development with Funcom actually. Though players and critics alike would acknowledge what everyone else was acknowledging in droves, especially the active player base, and that was bugs. I hate bugs. It wouldn't be a Funcom game without bugs, but the bugs in Conan Exiles and now Dune Awakening were more significant because they could lead to the loss of your items and thus time and enjoyment in a way that most MMOs can't, due to it just being strictly a survival game. Worse, if you had a bug and wanted to report it, one that would include the loss of your things, you would have to deal with the Funcom support team, or the Funcom lack of support team, as they would feign ignorance, claim there was nothing they could do, and basically just find a million ways to tell you there was no way to figure out an inventory system and how to reimburse it. This was a crucial error from the team. When launching a virtual world, you have to be ready for customer and player relations. I know, they suck sometimes. I've worked in customer service, but you have to be on top of things. This includes the loss of items due to your game's issues, something that you have to be sensitive about because, well, it's your fault. This would be made worse by the issues in the Deep Desert, which we will be covering shortly. Let's first tackle the gameplay and Dune Awakening some more. You start in the Haga Basin, where the main plot also begins. And like critics and players have said alike, the story was engaging, and it followed the plot of Dune, of Paul Atreides, except in this story he wasn't born, allowing them to kind of experiment with all kinds of parts of the story, of course involving you, a Bene Gesserit agent tasked with finding the missing Fremen and waking the sleeper. The Haga Basin is to many players was as if Dune Awakening didn't have all the extra PvP stuff, and was just this cooperative survival PvE game. While you can PvP in the Haga Basin and the abandoned ships, nobody actually does it because in the end it's just losing gathering resources or materials, making it more about like PvG, or player versus gatherer. But after around 60 to 100 hours, depending on how fast you go, you would complete the Haga Basin story and progression, and be funneled to move towards the Deep Desert, especially after achieving your first ornithopter, which allowed you to fly around the overmap. But this Deep Desert had all kinds of problems. First off, whose idea was it to split it up into a bunch of instances that you can fly around in an overmap? While that's a kind of cool idea, if you're trying to make an actual emergent gameplay game, aka a PvP game, aka things happen in the Deep Desert, you probably shouldn't have done that. But the Deep Desert is where everything just falls off of a cliff, both like literally and figuratively. And where to start? The Deep Desert might have come after RuneScape's Wilderness, but it feels even older than it. In old school RuneScape, the wilderness has even more content than the Deep Desert does. You have bosses, altars, quests with actual story, and of course, PvP. You get XP and GP benefits as well from grinding the game's core gameplay. Contrast this to the Deep Desert and you have a zone that's now primarily about resources, not emergent gameplay or conflict over an interactive map. Worse, it's a zone you had to build in, since it's a survival game and not an MMORPG like RuneScape, or even an MMORPG like Phantasy Star Online, or more accurately, a sci-fi one like Global Agenda. Meaning after the weekly resets, you have to do it all over again. In survival games, historically, this always benefits guilds and those that play in big coordinated groups naturally, making solo or small group play difficult, but even more so in Dune Awakening for a couple of reasons. For starters, the combat is horrible. I'm not gonna mince words like others tried. The combat is janky and it just ends up being a badly animated spam fest in melee. Most players just prefer to grab rockets and blow each other up, not because that's just the most powerful thing, but because it's also just the most enjoyable thing. And that probably is your first experience as a small group or a solo player, getting blown up. Worse, besides just lackluster design in the Deep Desert, the bugs here are also even more deadly than the Haga Basin. The bugs or exploits in Funcom might have actually been like the hardest content presented in PvE and PvP. In the Deep Desert, you would have people build blocking you into your ornithopter, making you unable to fly away, or using said copter to fly into you, instantly killing you in a glitch that would then persist for months and allow you to be looted by them. Or random glitches would just start happening that would suddenly make you lose your things, including being eaten by an invisible worm. A recurring theme in the Dune series. Well, not the invisible part. Look, detectives, I have some thoughts about the whole Dune Awakening PvP as, versus PvE thing, and how it all shook out. For starters, while players want to hyper-focus on certain aspects when analyzing virtual worlds, survival games or not, you have to pay attention to the whole package. And not that package. I can't not address the elephant in the room either. The one that's going to be spammed in my comment section no matter how much I argue otherwise, and if I try to even respond to it, apparently, I'm just mad. That's that many players felt that PvP in Dune Awakening was forced and not fair in a sense.
In front of us on the left side of that pillar up there, guys. They're all stacked like we are.
Wait, are they
Look at they're running at us. Press something. Stop the swinging at me, bro. What is this? It's the dagger meta.
What becomes extrapolated from this and the feelings that it creates are usually doomsday delusional type claims of, see, PvP games never work, somehow ignoring the even larger elephant in the room, or mammoth, that states that the entire genre of survival games is PvP centric, including ones that are almost solely about PvP, like Rust. But there are some noticeable differences here. First, if we look at Dune Awakening as more of a survival game, then people's arguments for having private servers and accessible ones are actually like a strong argument, right? And if you lean into the MMORPG realm more, well then you have grander expectations that the game just totally fumbles on. And part of that is like things like safety, something that's actually more expected in an MMORPG versus a survival game. The best comparison we can make with the deep desert is the wilderness in old school RuneScape. Contrary to popular belief, PvP zones, no matter what, are always going to be controversial. And some are going to be way better than others. It's just that in old school RuneScape you have the wilderness, sure, but you also have like 300 plus worlds, by comparison to the 80 in Dune. This means that you with the right dedication and nerddom and sweatiness could pick the right server at the right time and make your journey through the wilderness much safer. But even then, people complain about the wilderness. I mean, there's a new profession they put behind the wilderness that drove people crazy because of that. And that's in a fairly PvP friendly game for a franchise that's now eclipsed $2 billion in revenue lifetime. The point I'm making is regardless of what you do, if you create something meant to create endless amounts of content or emergent gameplay that involves player conflict, no matter what kind, it's almost always going to be controversial. The reason that old school RuneScape works more than Dune Awakening is because you can avoid the wilderness in old school RuneScape and still have the complete full in-game experience, pretty much. In Dune, limiting resources to a PvP-enabled zone is not inherently bad and doesn't really contradict their claim that PvP is optional. I know, sorry guys. You can't get everything in a world without any risk, not even a virtual world, especially if that's the vision for the game. The most successful virtual worlds have audiences that enjoy both PvP and PvE, but they all approach how they address these players in different ways. So then how did some of these succeed? Well, we have an example. Dark Ages of Camelot, as we mentioned before, is one of the most successful MMORPGs of all time and a pioneer in its genre, especially PvP. Dark Ages of Camelot found success by introducing players to PvE and PvP early, instead of keeping it hidden behind 100 hours of gameplay. This is the same thing one of the game's spiritual successors did most famously, in my opinion, the most successfully in terms of appealing to non-PvPers and casual players alike. And that's Warhammer Online, a game that has PvP from basically like the very beginning of the game. These games knew having these audiences overlap and making PvP accessible, and not building like separate hate factions and whatever else, would be the best approach, especially when an economy is needed to make PvP games work, and those usually include more of a PvE style player. Now, another major key and crucial lacking aspect of Dune Awakening and well, New World as well, another similar style game we've already covered, was that factions were utterly pointless. They were just coats of paint. They had progression, sure, but it was pretty forgettable and not really unique. AAA devs seem to realize emergent gameplay is so crucial and, well, sexy, but have utterly no idea how to actually accomplish it in a sandbox environment. The whole ado of players can do anything really amounts to just players doing a whole lot of nothing. You need to give players guidance, teach them through repeat experiences, hopefully not traumatic ones, and build their confidence so that they can do things on their own. Factions are a great place to do this. They give you a base jumping point of power and understanding, and literally a starting point for new or returning players who might be baseless, for example. But if you don't actually build out a faction system, pun intended, well, you don't get any of the benefit of, simply just having it in your game. If you want to have a good faction system and a good world besides just having and housing a bunch of murder hobos, you're going to have to build more into the world. There has to be more than just one instance or area for socializing for an entire faction. There has to be more activities, more connectivity between the zones, and roles for players to participate in that aren't just combat related. If the only thing that you can do is gather and kill gatherers, well, that's going to be the core of the game. I saw someone put it really nicely in the comments of a Dune review section one time, that Dune Awakening was a total oops game, full of oops moments. Oops, a bug made me lose all of my stuff. Oops, a bug made me die. Oops, I got killed by an invisible worm. Oops, my guild just got killed by like 6 people that blew us up with rockets. That's not the kind of experience you want your game to be like synonymous with, and that's because expecting players to be assholes should be a given. And if you want to make a controversial shared in-game PvP zone, you should definitely have that in mind. How the changes would shake out after all of this drama would make or break the already struggling survival online game, and what I was seeing wasn't good. Sure, many of the angry fans would be happy, thinking that these changes would somehow mean the game is fixed for them, but these changes were just band-aid fixes, and no actual acknowledgement that the base design of the game was flawed. Funcom would introduce partial warfare or PvE zones to the deep desert, which would seemingly alleviate some of the problem, temporarily, but this wasn't addressing the fact that there wasn't anything to do in the game but mine for resources, and fight people for those resources, and of course build. But once you're done with that, you sort of moved on. The problem is that the game requires a constant monthly upkeep or taxes to keep your stuff, around. If you miss any payments, you could lose your whole base. When you don't build a world to be social, and one that can be like returned to without having like a big negative for that, in the end, achieving power is the only thing you can do, and you have to do it while sprinting on a treadmill. And once you do that, you sort of beat the game. Sure, Dune Awakening was planning for more content at some point, but they were bleeding so many players at an alarming rate and making radical changes that were angering their core audience that was left. How many would even wait around for new content to drop if the game wasn't enjoyable and continued to lose players? Still, Dune Awakening, Shifty Sand or not, would be the company's fastest selling release yet, selling a whopping 1 million copies at a full price of $50. But whether or not they could keep this player base with how the game was designed to keep running on would remain to be seen, and things weren't looking good in that direction unless major changes would happen. Patch 1.110 would drop just weeks after launch and would introduce some nice changes to the death and respawn system, as well as reportedly fixing many of the game's exploits. Oh yeah, we talked about bugs, but we didn't really talk about exploits. They're more of like something that players figure out how to do over and over again for a massive benefit. And in Dune Awakening, like in Age of Conan much before it, it was plagued by tons of them. You had duplication glitches, item infinite repair glitches, even a way to stack a temp buff to make you invulnerable, a bug that let players loot a crash ship entirely, and even having the ability to fly and travel underground. Funcom had this super weird approach to numerous exploits too. They would claim, hey, things are fixed, and then patches later claim the same thing. But as of just weeks ago, I've been told by players that player exploits still exist, and the game still doesn't feel 100% yet. It was just a total mess, and like with Age of Conan, a mess on a grand scale for all to see. The next patch would allow for Tier 6 resources, which were normally locked behind specific spots in the deep desert, to be pushed to wider areas in the PvE section of the deep desert. Again, this was just shifting the problem to another region of the map. Had a massive amount of players who enjoyed the game pre-Deep Desert and were bummed that the endgame was only taking place there. That's not the same as them not feeling it's fair they can't get the best stuff though. It's more so that they just feel like they're not even included. And can you blame them? The factions and NPCs in the game have little to no impact, so unless you're a murder hobo, or organized guild, or someone really who likes to scramble away like a fleeing roach whenever being chased, there was little place for you in Dune Awakening. So moving resources around seemed helpful, but for who? The better alternative was to find more ways to include players who didn't want to travel to the deep desert, or give those players who did more tools to escape if they weren't combatants. An example of this is showcased in Albion Online, a fairly PvP-centric game. Gatherers and crafters can wear special gear that makes catching them out in the open actually quite difficult, and it gives them a ton of tools to flee the scene. Funcom's decisions were being made. They weren't being idle about things, but their decisions were piecemealing everything, and weren't at all fixing the larger problems, even beside the deep desert. The new changes would amount to even more slicing up of the deep desert. At this point, if players weren't okay with your core design, they were already not going to be okay with the game regardless of how much you kept trying to plug holes in it in small ways. Now you're just pissing off the players who actually liked it. That audience that you grew with titles like Age of Conan, a hardcore PvP game, and Conan Exiles, another hardcore PvP game. A common sentiment I had sent to me by players like this was that, hey, we felt that the game was already being made for us, and they were clear about it. And now they're changing it away from that, and we're losing enjoyment because less players are playing the game, and more zones are being divided, so even less players are available. Even as a roadmap was released, showcasing more content to come, something Conan Exiles utterly failed at even though they did release one. By the way, fans just didn't have much faith. Not only because of prior experiences, but because the population of the game was jumping off of a cliff, starting at a whopping 189,000 players peak, which was super impressive, and moving within just 2 months down to 46,500 players peak. It was going to be hard to plug these massive gaping holes in the core foundation of their game, especially as the dark cloud around the game would only continue to grow. Sure, some players would make the distinction that the game was still pretty good outside of the endgame, but less and less over time would make that distinction, making the overall perspective from Dune Awakening, from the outside perspective, quite a negative one, which is a shame, because there's some quality there, it's just attached to a whole other game that just didn't work. But the biggest kicker for me was even when you could on one hand give Funcom some credit for how active and fast their updates were coming out, the problem was the updates were the sort of stuff you already expected a company with 20 years of experience to have figured out. You have to realize, the Funcom team that built Dune Awakening is largely the same core team that built the previous online games. Whether that's good or bad, they stuck with many of the same developers. This kind of approach has its positives. It works in building synergy, and it has a crew that just works really well together, right? But what if you don't have the talent to fill those gaps, and you need to? My issue with staying with the same team, title after title, is that these titles have had some massive blundery aspects to them, and if you're still making those same mistakes and barely adding things like an auto toggle run later on after the game comes out, it just means that the developers aren't learning, whether from their mistakes or applying themselves to playing the games in the genre. With Dune Awakening dropped to a 59% mixed score, Funcom was already having to hold on to their butts. Chapter 2 was a free update that would update some things. That kind of goes without saying. But with the Lost Harvest DLC, which cost $13 as a paid DLC, you could now progress the story further. But the story was a one-chain quest for a vehicle that you essentially wouldn't ever even use, a bike. Worse, players had expected a new building set, but actually only just got a couple of pieces. And weirdly enough, the vehicle I just mentioned doesn't even fit in those pieces. People were even going as far to call this DLC a scam, or that it could have introduced the story for free and over email without having to make you curry your quest around the map for some reason over and over again in a sci-fi game. Remember, Funcom was a self-publisher. Sure, their departments are probably functioning separately, but what I'm trying to say is that they didn't need to push this DLC out at the price that it was, with so little to show for it. They could have just used this as an opportunity to give good grace and show that they had more in store to come. Instead, players feel like you're monetizing them for finishing the game, and content that feels like it was cut from the game in the first place even, or could have been included in a free update. You can see the community's feelings of betrayal reflected in the population, I think, where although the previous month it held quite nicely, at the start of October things would half that and drop to just 21,000 players peak on Steam. Taking literally months to come up with the idea, Funcom would finally implement a vehicle recovery system in Dune Awakening, which would allow for players to pay a fee in Solari, the game's currency system, while accepting a max 15% durability loss to revive their vehicle. You would have up to 2 days to complete this process. This was a solid gesture, and serving essentially like an insurance system. The problem again is that this concept has already existed in other games. Why did Funcom seemingly do no market research to find out that they could have perhaps softened the blow for the PvE-centric players if they thought about bringing this into the game whenever it launched? I mean, it would help PvE players if they knew that they could mitigate more losses. I mean, it was a good update though, but people were really expecting more on the update front, especially on the base front, which was still a tedious process of being unable to unpack your base for travel or even just take a break and not play the game. That update would take another month to drop, and alongside it would come with server transfers. Starting with the base backup tool, it was the ability for players to basically copy and paste their bases and pack them up to place them elsewhere, or at a later date. A cool system, but we're talking nearly 6 months after the launch of the game that people have been asking for something like this. It's not a small ask either. The downside to not delivering on people's promises, or rather desires here, is the same as making sure that a disgruntled player is not going to leave your game and never come back, because they know they're coming back to nothing. So it's a compounding issue. Server transfers on the other hand, and why they weren't at launch, I have no idea. Although all players share the same deep desert technically, remember, world servers are at under 100 and with a couple dozen per region. Early on at launch, some players thought that due to the sharding system they could still play cross-world server, but that wasn't the case, making your choice of server very punishing, especially when playing in the group was so crucial in Dune Awakening. Allowing them now to have server transfers felt like not just a slow move, but kind of like a slap to the face, when the population of the game was only at 12,000 peak players now. Not many of those 1 million players were left, and thus the server transfers weren't really holding much water anymore. What used to be 80 plus servers with tons of players is now the same amount of servers, but with only a little bit amount of players on each of them. While this sort of arrangement can work out for some survival games as the community then expands the game alongside the developers, which is what Conan Exiles did, Dune Awakening didn't allow for that, making it, this is what you get. And I can't imagine a server functioning properly even as absent as they are already from community aspects existing in the game with only 10 players. more changes would come, such as the ability to transport vehicles, which was a cool and very sci-fi touch in addition. But a slightly controversial update would also be pushed during the same time, and pushed by the most casual fanbase left playing Dune, and that was the switch from open loot to personal loot. Now, sorry, personal loot to me is not something that should ever really happen that often. Sometimes, sure, as it does feel rewarding and it's an easy way to make everyone feel included, but if a game is based on personal loot, it kind of ruins the actual connectivity of the game and the looting aspects and how fun that is. Personal loot rewards avoid making contact and conflict. So while somebody might have had like something on a timer before, now somebody has something on a timer and they don't have to interact with you. Which also goes against the whole core of what Funcom was trying to build. Personal loot makes sense in like Warhammer Online, where whenever you kill a player in a factional warfare, you get some loot from it, like gold and like a trinket. The point is it works in certain games, but not in the games built around full looting, and looting other players usually with like materials and stuff, and it's essentially antithetical to that. In a cooperative game, however, it could work, like The Forest has at times. But that game's not about PvP at all, showing maybe once again that perhaps Dune Awakening was better off not being as well. I know this might surprise some of you since I've been defending the initial vision, but I was defending that vision in the sense that that was what they wanted. And if they wanted that, they had to commit to it. But as a fan of Dune, I don't think that this should have been a PvP-centric game, let alone even have PvP in the first place. There's tons of survival games that don't. The Forest, like I mentioned, Grounded, and many more. Why did Funcom think PvP whenever they thought about the Dune franchise? I thought they were fans. Because I just don't see it. These are people without established ways of living in a modern context, meaning that they're just like fighting for basic survival. The concept of like PvP for status or factional warfare doesn't really make sense in a more kind of like obvious sense, like in Dark Ages of Camelot. PvP works in Fallout because people are more established and, well, eccentric. But when the biggest focus in Dune is just surviving Arrakis, why are people spending so much time fighting each other? And before you tell me conflict existed in Dune, obviously it does, but primarily from the perspective of the Fremen, the underdogs. They wouldn't be PKing each other as the same faction, and neither would the other factions even really. Why is factional inter-PvP even in the game from a story perspective? I'll say it, I just don't think that Dune Awakening should have been a PvP game. And if it was forced to be one, it seems like it was just because it was using the same engine and even UI system that Conan Exiles was. I think that the game should have been closer to The Forest, Dune style, or how art works on PvE servers. I think if they wanted to build some deep interconnected kingdom-esque warfare game, they should have just done that. For starters, and second, chose or created a better suited IP for that. Oh, did I mention that they had dungeons in this game? I didn't because they're so unremarkable. They basically shake down to you being ported into an instance and having to do horde-style defense against oncoming enemies. These enemies, though, aren't challenging, and the two different bosses only have a few tricks up their sleeve and aren't really that impressive or challenging either. The game consists of you fighting either humans or zombie-like creatures too, and they exhibit the same behaviors throughout the game, even in the dungeons, with no new additions or added challenge later on, making the game just get boring after a while. Chapter 3, though, would be teased in December of 2025, and Funcom would talk about the possibility for more contracts or repeatable activities, and a more expanded story. How they sold it, though, wasn't convincing, as it was apparently all hinging on the expanded Landsrad system, a system that already existed, that people didn't like in other games that they rebranded and renamed for this game, was supposed to be the one to connect it all together. I can't make that up. And then there were promises of a major endgame revamp as well, with no actual details into how or why, other than that it was going to be a process. Funcom. But at this point, Dune Awakening had dropped below Conan Exiles numbers on Steam, a game that came out ages ago by comparison, and that's not counting the fact that, well, Conan Exiles was playable on console too. Something that still hasn't come to Dune Awakening yet, and is promised in the next year. But anyway, the peak population now was as low as 6,900 players, lower than a game that came out like over 6 years ago. This is a long shot from their crazy early launch numbers, and even if you think they were supposed to drop just to at least half of that, this was only 3.65% of the audience left. And that's not counting all of those who bought the game, which makes that percentage even lower. This, alongside me not having faith in Funcom, the company, and the lack of actual tangible plans forward for the revamp of the endgame, is why I put Dune Awakening on the Death of a Game series, despite it not actually being literally dead yet. Funcom has a history of pulling out their major support and moving on to the next project. I mean, despite Conan Exiles' later success, it's exactly what they did with that game for this game. And the cloud surrounding Dune Awakening is one of the most negative I've seen around Funcom, period. So the music's playing detectives, and that means that the timeline has ended, and this case is coming to an end. But technically, the case hasn't been solved yet, and that's what we will be doing shortly, collecting all of the clues obtained throughout the timeline so we can piece them together for our final deduction. In case you weren't paying attention or missed any of the clues, why did Dune Awakening ultimately fail to maintain an audience in just a few months? Funcom was just doing Funcom things apparently. Poor community support and relations, conflicted survival game design, bad and buggy combat. Speaking of bugs, endless amounts of them, and exploits. The endgame design is antiquated, flawed, and just not very fun. Critical ears were closed when dealing with feedback clearly. Now, the story of Dune Awakening might still be carrying on as we speak, but with Funcom at the helm, and their track record with their other high-profile failures, specifically like Age of Conan, I think that this shows that the lessons aren't being learned at the company. You can't be confused why Funcom seems to be Funcom anymore, and keeps Funcomming it up. We know why. It's the same people, doing the same things, and making basically the same mistakes. This means I can't really put words of encouragement here or other friendly advice, because they haven't been paying attention clearly. Instead, I can talk to you guys, the audience who plays their games, and warn you, I saw Dune Awakening coming, and hopefully after watching this video and other Funcom videos you've watched of mine, you can also see it coming as well. Look, I know it's hard, virtual worlds aren't super common, and Funcom does have talent, and when people grab a nice IP and popular IP, it's sexy, let's just be honest. And look, I'm a fan. Funcom made my favorite adventure game ever, Dreamfall. But if you feel suspicious like I did with Dune Awakening, whether due to unshown gameplay or concepts not just being fully fleshed out, trust your gut next time. I think your bank account will thank you. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you thought of Dune Awakening below in the comment section. Stay tuned for the next case.
But I've waited so long to see it again.